All right, now we're in Genesis chapter 32. We have Jacob's escape from Laban, and Laban pursuing him in the previous chapter. And they made peace. And Laban returned home. I don't know what all he thought he was going to accomplish in all of this. And Jacob rightly admonished Laban that he had kept every bargain with Laban that they had made. He served him faithfully, and Laban benefited greatly from Jacob. And so we get a little impression that Jacob is sort of saying, the only reason that you don't want me to leave is because you've gained financially while I was with you. So Laban really had no excuse. So they set up, as often happens, a heap of stones. In those days, they would make monuments of different types to remember covenants or agreements. Sometimes they were altars. Sometimes they were pillars of stones stacked on top of one another. We see this in a number of places. Remember, we saw it when Israel crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land, and they picked up stones from the middle of the Jordan and piled them up into a great heap so that people would see those and remember the crossing and entering into the Promised Land, and they were to use those to remind their children. All right, chapter 32. Remember, what do we have left now? Jacob had stayed behind. He separated his groups into two groups. Did we do 32? Yeah, we did 32. Yeah. Yeah, we did 32. So Jacob split his company, everything into two groups of people, so that Esau couldn't attack both at the same time. And Jacob stayed behind and had another bodily encounter with God. The angel of the Lord, which is just described as a man, wrestled with Jacob until the break of day. And Jacob, as we saw, knew that this was the Lord. And once again, Jacob received the blessing that Abraham received, and then later Isaac received. Jacob also receives it. God reinforces it. Each of these times, God himself appearing to the fathers, to the patriarchs, and giving them the promise of Christ and reinforcing the promise of Christ, and generation after generation repeating the promise. In the case of Jacob, because he prevailed with God, we've used this very often as a model for prayer, because as we know full well, God could not be defeated by Jacob. He allowed himself to appear in some way as Jacob's enemy, in another way as ineffective and weak. As after all, Jacob somehow is holding on to God so that God can't break free. Well, of course, that's not possible. And yet God does this. The purpose is twofold in the case of Jacob. God wants Jacob to trust the promises of God. And so the same thing is true in our prayers. Sometimes our prayers feel like a struggle with God because he doesn't seem to be powerful and he seems to be weak against the things that are happening in this world. And he wants us to pray at those times, even if the prayer feels like a struggle, trusting that God cannot break his promises, that God will keep them. And we pray holding God to his promises. And that's an exercise of faith. So then God names Jacob Israel, the one who prevails with God. And this is the name now he's known by, but you'll see he's called Jacob and Israel both from this point forward. All right, chapter 33. See how it all worked out. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. Okay, so then he divides them up. So he divided the children. So remember, he'd already divided all of his flocks up and his men up. And now here's Esau with 400 men. Now, what's the first thing you think? Well, Esau was going to kill him before. And if Esau's got an army with him, you think surely, there he comes, just as I feared. And so now that it's just Jacob, Leah, Rachel, and their children, nobody else, now he divides them up again. He splits his children up between Rachel and Leah. And there's some of their servants there as well. And he put the servants with their children in front, and Leah with all their children, and then Rachel and Joseph last of all. And he himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times, until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to him, and embraced him, and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So why does he have the 400 men? I think that Esau knew that Jacob had become mighty when he was with Laban, his brother, his uncle. And Esau was afraid, I threatened to kill Jacob, and now he's coming back to kill me in force. And he's grown mighty in all this time. Maybe I can't withstand him. And so Jacob had his men for him, maybe for that reason, but that's speculation. But Jacob showed that this was not in his mind, because not only had he separated his groups apart, but he came bowing down before Esau. All right. Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" And Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the servants drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And last Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." So remember, what did Jacob do? He sent a whole bunch of gifts Esau's direction. He says, "You go first." I want the first thing he sees to be a big present, like lots and lots of sheep and oxen and everything else as a present for him. Doing everything he can to turn Esau's heart from murder. So that's the company that he's talking about. The word is literally camp. And Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord. I don't want to be at war with you. I want to be at peace with you." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." So in the time in between, remember, Esau's there with Jacob. He doesn't inherit the blessing of as the firstborn, but he still inherits a large portion. So the way these would work, the primary ownership belongs to the firstborn normally. And the way that they often did it is they would divide up the inheritance among the sons plus one. And the firstborn, the chief one, the one who receives the chief blessing, would get a double portion compared to all the others. And so Jacob, we already know, was a prosperous man. Esau still had quite enough for himself, just from the blessing he had. And no doubt in that time he increased that blessing while Jacob was 20 years with Laban. What?
Well, yeah, you notice with Jacob having to go to Laban and working under Laban, Esau inherited the lands that Abraham had.
No, he doesn't inherit them.
He doesn't?
No, but he would inherit a significant portion. So if there was only Jacob and Esau that could inherit, Jacob would have divided up everything into 3 parts, 2 parts would have been for Isaac would have divided up everything into 3 parts. 2 parts would go to Jacob, 1 part would go to Esau. But Isaac was but remember, Isaac was also very, very successful. So there would still be a significant amount, and then of that portion, Esau would continue to grow and increase.
Well, it would just seem like since Jacob left, Esau would still control those lands that had originally been Isaac's and had grown.
Maybe in a sense, but they're still
It would have still
they belong
belonged
to Jacob. They belong to Jacob. Yeah. So Jacob said, "Please, if I have found favor in your sight, accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me." So what does that mean? "Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." Thus he urged him, and he took it. God had given Jacob the promise. And ultimately, for God's promise to be kept, Jacob and his inheritance cannot be taken away by Isaac or by Esau. His life and his possessions cannot be taken away, and he and his household be destroyed, because then God's promise would fail. Jacob sees in Esau's reception the face of God, because the fact that Esau immediately came reconciling, Jacob said, "This is God being faithful to his promise also." All right, so please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. Thus he urged him, and he took it. Then Esau said, "Let us journey on our way, and I will go ahead of you." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they're driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly, at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me, and at the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." Remember, a traveling group of men that don't have women and children and flocks and everything else with them can move quickly. And Esau is eager. So I think there's still a slight note of caution here. Jacob doesn't want to be separated from everybody else, but also, I don't want to be perceived as coming with force either. And so Jacob comes slowly with everyone else. So Esau said, "Let me leave with you some of the people who are with me." But he said, "What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord." So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore the name of the place is called Succoth, which means booths. Sukkot in Hebrew, you'll hear about even today among the Jews, and for booths. Why? Well, we have the Feast of Booths. Sukkot is the Feast of Booths, as it became known. So, in other words, they wouldn't say the word feast always; they just call it booths. Remember when they would make the tabernacles to remember that they were sojourners in the wilderness and in Egypt. Okay. So Jacob said he will go to his Lord in Seir, but he didn't go there. He went to Sukkot first and built a house and got his livestock all settled down. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Padan Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent, and there he erected an altar and called it El Elohe Israel, the God of Israel. God, the God of Israel, in other words. El Elohe Israel. Okay, so they now have returned. And Jacob is at peace with Esau the rest of this time. We hear no more about enmity between Jacob and Esau. However, what's done is done. Jacob did receive the inheritance. The descendants of Esau never forgot. And they envied the promised land and were constantly enemies in later generations of Israel. The next time we see them come up after these events is when Israel returns out of Egypt back. And they want to go through the land of Edom. Well, the land of Edom is where the descendants of Esau were a nation now. And they refused to allow them to pass through. And that's why they went around to the side of the Jordan River and came across the Jordan through Moab. All right. Chapter 34. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, so we have the one daughter, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and lay with her and humiliated her. So Shechem, we just had a reference to it. The sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he's living in an area that they have control over.
I wonder how this could possibly go for them.
Yeah. And his soul was drawn to Dinah. So in other words, he raped her.
Yeah.
And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. And he loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get this girl for my wife." So in other words, he forced himself on her, but then he wanted her for his wife. Now Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with his livestock in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came. And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. The sons of Jacob had come in from the field as soon as they heard of it, and the men were indignant and very angry because he had done an outrageous thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter. For such a thing must not be done. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, "The soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him to be his wife. Make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us and take our daughters for yourselves." What's the problem here? You're Canaanites. "You shall dwell with us, and the land shall be open to you. Dwell and trade in it, and get property in it." Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me, I will give." And so Shechem, the father of the one who did, the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father. What are we saying here? I'm getting the names mixed up. So Shechem is the son. All right. So Shechem is trying to now, after having done the deed, make peace with Jacob, her father. So, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me I will give. Ask for me as great a bride price and gift as you wish, and I will give whatever you say to me. Only give me the young woman to be my wife." The sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully, because he had defiled their sister Dinah. They said to them, "We cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. Only on this condition will we agree with you, that you will become as we are, by every male among you being circumcised." Now normally circumcision was done when they were babies at 8 days of age. When it's done to an adult male, it lays them out for a while. Then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to ourselves, and we will dwell with you and become one people. Jacob's sons knew full well that God had forbidden them to intermarry with the Canaanite tribes. And the Hivites were Canaanites, which means they were idol worshippers. "But if you will not listen to us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and we will be gone." So their words pleased Hamor and Hamor's son Shechem, and the young men did not delay to do the thing because he delighted in the young man, because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. Now he was the most honored of all his father's house. So Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of their city and spoke to the men of their city, saying, These men are at peace with us. Let them dwell in the land and trade in it, for behold, the land is large enough for them. So you notice something here. They got a whole city that they're talking about. And they're in a nice, prosperous land, but Jacob and all of his rivals them in power and size, to the point where they couldn't risk Jacob being angry with them anyway. Right? All right, the land is large enough. Let us take their daughters as wives, and let us give them our daughters. So, unite in a treaty. They become one people now because they intermarry, and now they're stronger together, right? That's what the Hivites wanted. Only on this condition will the men agree to dwell with us to become one people, when every male among us is circumcised, as they are circumcised. So, this is what you see here is everybody knew in Canaan knew that the manner of these Israelites is different. They circumcised their children, their boys, and the men are all circumcised, something that none of the nations practiced. This made them weird, because there was no reason to do such a thing. Why would you do such a thing? And we see part of God's intention in instituting circumcision was to separate Israel from the nations, to be a mark in their flesh saying, these are my people, and you will not be as the nations. All right. Will not their livestock, their property, and all their beasts be ours? Only let us agree with them, and they will dwell with us. Seemed like a small price to pay for gaining a great deal of advantage and power over their enemies. And all who went out of the gate of his city listened to Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of his city. On the third day, as would happen, when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, Simon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city while it felt secure and killed all the males. So the brothers were very shrewd here. So it wasn't just Shechem. They knew that if they tried to kill Shechem, well, they got an entire city of armed men who would immediately slaughter them. So they figured out a way to put all of the armed men out of commission before they did it. All right. Now, was this deceitful and evil? Was this an evil thing they did? It's a debatable question, of course. But they certainly were practicing in a deceiving way. I'm not ready to answer that question, quite frankly. People will say, well, they lied. Yes, that's true. They lied. But God sometimes has his prophets intentionally lie as a punishment against a people. Or we think about Rahab lying to the men who were coming searching for the spies that had come into the land and were in Jericho. And she lied to them and sent them off a different direction to protect the lives of the men. But regardless, what we have here is not a prescription that you should do as the sons of Jacob did. The Bible is simply straightforward and honest and historical. It describes what happened, good or bad. All right. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword, and they took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain, and they plundered the city because they had defiled their sister. They took their flocks and their herds, their donkeys, and whatever was in the city and in the field, all their wealth, all their little ones, their wives, so those would have become slaves. All that was in the houses they captured and plundered. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few, so you might have been able to take one city when they were all put down, but that's one city. Think about the massive number of people that are in this land once they hear what you've done. My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household. But they said, should we treat our sister like a prostitute? Should they not avenge her? What happened? All right. So, we don't hear that there is any consequences from the people of the land, but this is what Jacob was worried about. Next time we have God, we have the blessing of God, the re-emphasizing of his name for Jacob, the deaths of Rachel, the deaths of Isaac, and so then we'll hear about Esau's descendants, which we're going to skip through pretty quickly because it's a lot of genealogy, and then on to the next main chapter, Jacob and the story of Joseph.
So then, was Esau greater in wealth than Jacob at the time that he came?
We're not told.
Because it would seem like
He probably had more men.
We're not told. We'd have to guess. We'd have to guess, but